On a cross-country flight from Atlanta to Seattle, the recycled air hums with the quiet anxieties of travel. For one mother and her 8-year-old son, it's a journey toward a new life. For a stressed executive in business class, it's a mere inconvenience. But when a child's innocent restlessness collides with a man's deep-seated prejudice, the cabin of Flight AS-421 becomes a pressure cooker. What happens next is not just a confrontation. It's a moment that will be seared into the memory of every passenger. A single shocking act of violence against a child, followed by the quiet courage of one stranger who refuses to look away, triggering a cascade of consequences that no one could have ever predicted. The Boeing 737 was a world unto itself, a pressurized tube hurtling through the stratosphere at 500 miles per hour. Inside, the lives of 160 strangers were temporarily interwoven, their paths crossing for 6 hours in a space no larger than a city bus. For Sarah Jenkins, seated in 14B, this flight was the final exhausting leg of a monumental life change. Beside her, in 14C, her son Leo was a bundle of contained energy, his dark curls bouncing as he peered out the window at the endless carpet of clouds. At 8 years old, Leo was a bright, inquisitive boy, but the last year had been hard on him. The sudden loss of his father to a heart attack had hollowed out their small world in Georgia. Seattle represented a fresh start. Sarah had landed a promising job as a pediatric nurse at Seattle Children's Hospital, a role that felt more like a calling than a career. They had sold the house, packed their lives into boxes, and were now flying toward a future they hoped would be brighter, or at the very least kinder. Leo, resilient as children are, was mostly excited. He had his tablet, a new set of noise-canceling headphones, and a backpack full of Legos. Still, Sarah could see the flicker of anxiety in his eyes. He'd occasionally look up at her, his big brown eyes seeking reassurance. Each time she'd give him a warm smile and a gentle squeeze on the shoulder, a silent promise that everything would be okay. "Mom, are we there yet?" he whispered, his voice muffled by his headphones. "Not for a while, sweetie," she whispered back, stroking his hair. "Why don't you watch your movie up ahead in seat 4C? Robert Peterson sighed with theatrical impatience. He loosened his tie, the silk fabric feeling like a noose. The deal in Atlanta had been a nightmare. He was a senior vice president of acquisitions for Acuity Corp, a ruthless real estate development firm, and the negotiation had nearly collapsed 3 times. He'd salvaged it, as he always did, through sheer force of will and intimidation, but it had left him frayed and volatile. All he wanted was silence, a double scotch, and the familiar comfort of his sprawling home in Bellevue. He was a man accustomed to control. His world was one of order, of hierarchies he understood and dominated. The chaos of public travel was a grating annoyance. The crying babies, the chatty seatmates, the general inefficiency, it all offended his sense of propriety. He'd already snapped at the gate agent over a perceived slight and had glared at the flight attendant who asked him to put his briefcase fully under the seat in front of him. His patience, a notoriously shallow well, was already dry. From his seat, he could hear the faint, tinny sounds of explosions and cartoonish action leaking from the headphones of the child several rows back. It was a minor irritation, but to Robert's overtaxed mind, it was like a needle prick to a nerve. He turned his head slightly, his gaze falling on Leo. He saw a restless black child, poorly supervised, in his opinion, a symbol of the disorder he so despised. His lip curled into a sneer he didn't bother to hide. A few rows behind Robert in 7A, Marcus Thorne was trying to sleep. He was an ER doctor at Harborview Medical Center in Seattle, flying home from a medical conference on trauma care. The irony was not lost on him. He spent his days stitching together the results of human error and malice, and conferences like these were meant to sharpen his skills. But they were also draining. He was a man who ran on empathy, and his tank was running on empty. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a calm, watchful demeanor that he'd cultivated over years in the chaotic trenches of emergency medicine. His face, usually a mask of professional composure, was etched with fatigue. He had noticed the family when they boarded. The mother's gentle but weary patience, the boy's vibrant energy. He'd also noticed the man in business class, Robert Peterson. He'd seen the type 1,000 times in the ER, men in expensive suits, whose sense of entitlement was so profound it became a tangible force, warping the reality around them, expecting the world to bend to their will. Marcus had seen Peterson's dismissive wave to the flight attendant and the condescending tone he'd used. He'd filed it away under a mental category he simply called trouble and hoped it wouldn't escalate. He closed his eyes, the drone of the engines, a familiar lullaby, and prayed for a few hours of peace. The first hour of the flight passed without incident. The drink service came and went. Robert Peterson had his two scotches, the amber liquid doing little to soothe his temper. It only seemed to sharpen the edges of his anger, honing it to a fine point. Sarah managed to get Leo to eat half of his sandwich and to switch from his action movie to a quieter puzzle game on his tablet. But a child's energy is a relentless tide. After a while, Leo grew bored. He began to fidget. He swung his legs and his sneakers lightly, almost imperceptibly, tapped against the back of the seat in front of him, seat 13C. The woman in that seat, a young student engrossed in a textbook, didn't even notice. But Robert Peterson, scanning the cabin with a predator's idle malevolence, did. He saw the slight jostle of the seat. He saw the black child no longer occupied becoming a potential source of disruption. His jaw tightened. Leo, oblivious, then dropped a small Lego piece. It skittered under his seat and into the aisle. "Oops," he said, unbuckling his seatbelt. "Leo, stay put." "I'll get it," Sarah said, starting to lean down. But Leo was quicker. He slipped out of his seat and into the aisle, dropping to his hands and knees to find the precious piece of plastic. As he did, the flight attendant was making her way down the aisle, collecting trash. "Excuse me, sweetie, can you pop back in your seat for me?" she said with a professional smile. "Just a second," Leo mumbled, his head under the seat. "I got it." He emerged triumphant, holding the small red block. As he stood up, he lost his balance for a second, stumbling sideways. His hand brushed against the armrest of seat 4C. Robert Peterson's armrest. For Robert, this was the final violation. The noise, the kicking, and now the physical contact. It was a breach of his personal space and affront to his authority. The simmering rage boiled over into a white-hot flash. "Watch where you're going, boy," he snarled, his voice low and menacing. Leo froze, his eyes wide. He'd heard the anger in the man's voice. Sarah, who was just starting to stand up to help him, also stopped, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. "I'm so sorry," she began, her voice placating. "He's just a child, he didn't mean." "He's just a child" is the excuse for everything, isn't it? Robert cut her off, his voice rising in volume, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. "People like you let your kids run wild with no discipline, no respect for anyone around them." The phrase "people like you" hung in the air, thick and toxic. Sarah felt a flush of heat rise up her neck. She knew exactly what he meant. She pulled Leo closer to her protectively. "Sir, there's no need to be rude," she said, her voice trembling slightly but firm. "He barely touched your seat." "I'll be the judge of that," Robert retorted, his face now floored with anger. He was leaning into the aisle, his presence looming and aggressive. "He's been a menace this entire flight. Kicking the seat, making noise. It stops now." He looked past Sarah, his cold eyes locking onto Leo, who was now hiding behind his mother's legs. "You need to learn some respect," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. And then, in a movement that was shockingly fast and utterly unforgivable, he reached out and slapped Leo across the face. It wasn't a hard slap, not enough to leave a serious bruise, but it was anything but gentle. It was a sharp, stinging crack of flesh on flesh, a sound of such profound violation that it seemed to suck the air out of the cabin. The intent was not to injure, but to humiliate and assert dominance. Leo let out a sharp, stunned cry, more of shock and fear than of pain. His hand flew to his cheek, his eyes welling with tears, as he buried his face in his mother's side. His small body racked with silent sobs. A collective gasp rippled through the surrounding rows. Time seemed to freeze. For a split second, there was only the hum of the engines and the sound of a child's shattered sense of safety. Sarah stood in stunned horror, her mind unable to process what had just happened. An adult, a strange man, had just struck her child. The spell was broken not by Sarah's scream or the flight attendant's protocol, but by a calm, booming voice from a few rows back. "That is assault." Every head turned. Dr. Marcus Thorne was on his feet. His face, once tired, was now a mask of cold, focused fury. He took 2 steps into the aisle, his large frame blocking the path. He wasn't yelling, but his voice cut through the stunned silence with the precision of a scalpel. He looked directly at Robert Peterson, his eyes unwavering. You just assaulted a child. Sit down and do not say another word. Robert Peterson, still buzzing with the adrenaline of his outburst, was momentarily taken aback. He was used to people cowering, not confronting him. He sneered, trying to regain the upper hand. This is none of your business. I was teaching the boy a lesson his mother clearly won't. My business is medicine, and you just struck a child in the head, Marcus replied, his voice remaining level, almost clinical. This unnerved Robert more than shouting would have. A blow to the head, however minor it seems to you, can have serious consequences. So for the second time, sit down. He then shifted his attention, his entire demeanor softening, as he looked past Robert to Sarah and Leo. Ma'am, are you okay? My name is Dr. Marcus Thorne. I'm an emergency physician. With your permission, I'd like to check on your son. Sarah, still in shock, could only nod mutely. She was clutching Leo, whose sobs were now quiet, hitched breaths of terror. The word doctor registered a small point of light in the overwhelming darkness of the moment. Marcus took another step forward, ignoring Robert completely now, as if he were an irrelevant piece of furniture. Sir, he said, his voice firm but not aggressive, addressing a man in the aisle seat next to Robert. Could you please let me pass? The man, a nervous-looking business traveler in his late 20s named David Chen, who happened to be Robert's junior colleague, practically scrambled out of his seat to let Marcus through. David had watched the entire exchange with a growing sense of horror, his fear of his volatile boss warring with his basic sense of decency. Marcus knelt in the aisle next to Sarah's seat. Hey there, buddy, he said softly to Leo. My name's Marcus. Can I see where he got you? Leo peeked out from behind his mother's arm. A red mark shaped vaguely like a hand was beginning to bloom on his cheek. It was stark against his brown skin. Tears streamed down his face, but he was no longer crying loudly. He was terrified. It's okay, Marcus said, his voice a low, soothing rumble. He didn't try to touch Leo. Instead, he started with simple questions. Can you tell me your name, Leo? The boy whispered. That's a great name, Leo. Can you follow my finger with your eyes for me? Marcus held up a finger, moving it side to side. Leo's eyes, wide and swimming with tears, tracked it perfectly. Good job. Does your head hurt anywhere else? Are you feeling dizzy or sick to your stomach? Leo just shook his head, pressing closer to his mom. He seems lucid and his pupillary response is normal, Marcus said, looking up at Sarah, speaking to her as a professional. But a facial strike is an absolute contraindication for being ignored. He needs to be monitored. He then looked directly at the flight attendant who had arrived on the scene, her face pale. This child has been assaulted. The captain needs to be notified immediately. Law enforcement must meet this plane at the gate. The authority in his voice was absolute. The flight attendant, a seasoned professional named Maria, nodded immediately. Yes, doctor. Right away. She spoke into her handset, her voice low and urgent. Robert Peterson, who had been watching this all unfold with growing disbelief, finally found his voice again. The attention was no longer on his perceived grievance, but on his criminal act. He was losing control and he hated it. This is ridiculous. It was a tap, an overreaction by everyone, he boomed. I am a senior vice president at Acuity Corp. I will not be treated like some common criminal. He pulled out his wallet, flashing a business card as if it were a badge of immunity. Marcus rose to his full height and turned to face him. Your job title is irrelevant, Mr. Peterson, he said, having read the name on the card. Assault is defined as an intentional act that causes another person to apprehend immediate and harmful contact. Battery is the actual harmful contact. You have, by definition, committed both, on an 8-year-old child, in front of at least 20 witnesses. He gestured around the cabin where dozens of phones were now discreetly pointed in their direction. I imagine some of them might even have it on video. The mention of video seemed to finally penetrate Robert's wall of self-righteousness. A flicker of genuine fear crossed his face. His junior colleague David Chen, who was still standing awkwardly in the aisle, flinched. David's own phone was in his pocket, but he hadn't dared to film his boss. The thought of the repercussions was too terrifying. Sarah had finally found her voice, a wave of pure protective rage washing away her shock. You hit my son, she said, her voice low and shaking with fury as she stood up, placing herself between Leo and Robert. You put your hands on my child. Who in God's name do you think you are, ma'am? Please, the flight attendant. Maria said, stepping between them. We're handling this. We've contacted the captain. We're going to need to move you. Sir, she said to Robert, I need you to come with me to the back of the plane. I'm not going anywhere, Robert snarled. I have a right to my seat. Sir, you have become a security threat. Maria said, her professional demeanor now hardened with steel. A male flight attendant, a burly man named Tom, had appeared from the rear galley, alerted to the situation. You can either walk to the back of the plane with me, or we can have you restrained. The choice is yours. Faced with two determined flight attendants, the unblinking gaze of a doctor who had just legally dissected his actions, and the silent judgment of an entire plane cabin, Robert Peterson finally relented. His face was a mask of thunderous rage. He shot a venomous glare at Sarah, Leo, and Marcus. You'll all be hearing from my lawyer, he hissed as he was escorted down the aisle toward the rear of the plane, a walk of shame past dozens of accusing eyes. With Robert gone, a tense quiet settled over row 14. Sarah sank back into her seat, pulling a still trembling Leo onto her lap, whispering reassurances into his hair. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind a deep seismic trembling in her limbs. Marcus remained for a moment. Ma'am, he said gently, my name is Marcus Thorne. Please take my card. When we land, the police will want to talk to you. They'll want witnesses. I saw the entire thing. I will give them a full statement. You and your son did nothing wrong. He handed her a simple white card that read, Marcus Thorne, MD, Emergency Medicine. Sarah took it, her hands shaking. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. Thank you. No thanks are necessary, he said quietly. Some things you just have to do. He gave a final reassuring nod to Leo and returned to his seat. The rest of the flight stretched before them, 4 more hours trapped in a metal tube, thick with the aftermath of a violence that was as ugly as it was sudden. Robert Peterson was physically gone from their vicinity, but his presence lingered, a toxic stain on the air. For Sarah, the hopeful journey to Seattle had turned into a nightmare at 35,000 feet. And for Robert Peterson, though, he was too arrogant to realize it, yet the real consequences had only just begun. The remainder of the flight was a study in tension. The flight attendants moved with a strained, hyper-professional calm, their smiles tight. Passengers spoke in hushed whispers, stealing glances toward the front, where Sarah comforted her son, and toward the rear, where Robert Peterson was sequestered in a jump seat near the galley, stewing in a potent brew of humiliation and rage. Sarah spent the hours holding Leo, who had cried himself into an exhausted, fitful sleep, on her chest. Each time he whimpered or twitched, her heart clenched with a fresh wave of pain and anger. She looked at the red mark on his cheek, which had faded slightly but was still visible, a brand of another man's hatred. She felt a profound sense of failure, an irrational guilt that she hadn't protected him, even though she knew there was nothing she could have done. Marcus Thorne sat in his seat, the desire for sleep long gone. He reviewed the incident in his mind, cataloging the details with the precision he would use for a patient chart. The aggressor's words, the sound of the slap, the child's reaction, the mother's shock. He knew this was more than a simple altercation. The racial undertone of Robert's "people like you" comment was a critical element. As an ER doctor in a major city, Marcus was no stranger to the physical and psychological toll of racism. He had treated victims of hate crimes and listened to patients describe the daily stress of navigating a world that often viewed them with suspicion. He remembered a recent study he'd read in a pediatric journal about the long-term health consequences of experiencing racism in childhood, including increased risks for depression, anxiety, and even chronic diseases. This wasn't just a slap. It was a poison administered to a child's soul. Finally, the captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and measured. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for arrival in Seattle. There was a brief pause. As a reminder, we ask that all passengers remain seated after we have parked at the gate until instructed otherwise by the cabin crew. Thank you for your cooperation. The message was clear. This was not a standard landing. As the plane descended through the gray Seattle sky, Sarah gently woke Leo. We're here, sweetie, she whispered. He was groggy and disoriented, the memory of what happened rushing back as he became fully awake. He clung to her wordlessly. The plane touched down with a gentle bump, and as it taxied toward the gate, A heavy silence fell over the cabin. Through the windows, passengers could see two police cars waiting on the tarmac, their lights off, but their presence unmistakable. The moment the seatbelt sign pinged off, a flight attendant's voice came over the PA system. "Ladies and gentlemen, for your safety and security, please remain in your seats. Port of Seattle Police will be boarding the aircraft." Two uniformed officers, a man and a woman, walked briskly up the jet bridge and onto the plane. They spoke quietly with Maria, the lead flight attendant, who pointed toward the back of the aircraft. They walked down the aisle, their faces impassive, and stopped next to Robert Peterson. "Sir, are you Robert Peterson?" the male officer asked. "Yes, and this is all a massive misunderstanding." Robert began, his voice a blend of indignation and forced calm. "We can discuss that at the precinct. Please gather your belongings. You'll be coming with us," the officer stated flatly. The click of handcuffs was audible several rows away. Robert's face went from red to a pasty white. The finality of the sound, the sheer indignity of it, seemed to finally break through his armor of entitlement. Without another word, he was escorted down the aisle, refusing to make eye contact with anyone, a fallen king being paraded through his former kingdom. Once he was off the plane, the female officer, Officer Miller, made her way to Sarah's row. Marcus was already standing in the aisle waiting. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Miller. We need to get a statement from you about what happened on the flight," she said kindly. "And we need to get your son's information as well. We have a victim's advocate who can meet with you." "Okay," Sarah croaked, her throat dry. "I'm Dr. Marcus Thorne," Marcus interjected, handing the officer his card. "I am a physician. I witnessed the entire event from the verbal altercation to the physical assault. I also rendered initial aid to the child. I'm prepared to give a full statement." Officer Miller took the card, her eyebrows raising slightly. A doctor was a credible, powerful witness. "Thank you, doctor. We'll definitely need to speak with you." She turned to the surrounding passengers. "Did anyone else see what occurred?" A few hands went up. The woman in 13C, whose seat had been kicked, spoke up. "I did. The kid was barely tapping my seat. I didn't even care. That man, he was just angry and looking for a fight." A man across the aisle chimed in. "I got a bit of it on my phone. The part right after he hit him." "Okay," Officer Miller said, taking down names and seat numbers. "We'll be taking all of you to a quiet area inside the terminal to get your statements." Down in the terminal, in a sterile conference room, the story was pieced together. Sarah, holding Leo's hand, recounted the events through tears, her voice gaining strength as she detailed the injustice. Marcus gave a clear, concise, and damning account, making sure to include Robert's exact words, including the racially charged people like you. He explained the medical implications of a strike to a child's head and the psychological trauma it could inflict. An incident like this isn't just about the physical act, Marcus told the officers, his voice resonating with the quiet authority of his profession. The American Academy of Pediatrics published a policy statement in 2019 confirming that racism is a core determinant of child and adolescent health. Experiencing this kind of targeted biased aggression can lead to toxic stress, which has been shown to disrupt developmental processes and increase the risk for long-term health problems. What Mr. Peterson did was not just assault, it was an act that can have lasting harm on this child's well-being. The other witnesses corroborated the story. The passenger with the video shared the file with the police. It captured the immediate shocking aftermath: Leo's cry, Sarah's horrified face, and Marcus standing up to confront Robert. It was powerful evidence. The only person who remained silent was David Chen, Robert Peterson's junior colleague. He was escorted to the conference room with the other witnesses, but when it was his turn to speak, he faltered. I was working," he stammered, looking at the floor. "I didn't really see it clearly. It was a lie, and he knew it. He had seen everything. But he also saw his career, which was so tightly tied to Robert's influence, flashing before his eyes. Fear won out over conscience. He gave a vague, non-committal statement and left as quickly as he could, his stomach churning with guilt. Robert Peterson, meanwhile, was at the Port of Seattle police station, learning the full scope of his predicament. He was officially charged with assault in the 4th degree. Under Washington state law, it was a gross misdemeanor, but because the victim was a child, it carried potentially severe penalties, including up to a year in jail and a $5,000 fine. His frantic calls to his high-powered corporate attorney were finally answered. The lawyer was blunt. This was serious. A public altercation on a plane, an assault on a child, multiple witnesses and video evidence. This was not something that could be easily handled. As Sarah and Leo were finally driven to their new empty apartment in a taxi, the reality of their arrival in Seattle crashed down upon them. Their new life had begun not with hope, but with a police report and a traumatic assault. As Sarah tucked a still subdued Leo into a makeshift bed on the floor, she clutched the business card Marcus had given her. In the cold, unfamiliar room, it felt like the only solid thing she had to hold on to. The battle was just beginning, and she felt terrifyingly alone. Within 12 hours, the sterile, contained world of the police station and the airport conference room exploded into the chaotic wilderness of the internet. The passenger who had filmed the aftermath, a tech blogger named Kevin Wu, had wrestled with his conscience for a few hours before deciding the public had a right to know. He uploaded the 45-second clip to Twitter, now X, with a simple caption: "Man on Alaska Airlines Flight 421 from ATL to C slaps a child. Appalling. Kudos to the doctor who stood up to him and the flight crew who handled it professionally. Cops met the plane." The video was electric. It didn't show the slap itself, but it captured something just as powerful: the raw, immediate aftermath. The sound of Leo's heartbroken sobs, Sarah's protective rage, and the calm, authoritative voice of Marcus Thorne cutting through the chaos. It was a perfect, terrible tableau of injustice and courage. By morning, it had 1 million views. By noon, 10 million. News outlets picked it up. Plane slap, acuity assault, and hero doctor were trending. Amateur internet sleuths with terrifying efficiency quickly identified Robert Peterson. They found his LinkedIn profile, his executive photo on the Acuity Corp website, and even articles from a local business journal celebrating his aggressive negotiation tactics. His identity was plastered across social media, his face becoming a symbol of white-collar rage and racist entitlement. For Robert Peterson, who had posted bail and returned to his pristine Bellevue mansion, expecting to quash the story with a team of lawyers, the world had turned upside down. His phone rang incessantly with calls from reporters. His email inbox was a digital torrent of hate. Acuity Corp's social media pages were bombarded with thousands of comments demanding his termination. The company, which prided itself on a carefully curated public image of corporate responsibility, was in full-blown panic mode. Acuity Corp's CEO, a polished man named Mark Fallon, called an emergency board meeting. Their initial instinct was to issue a vague statement about an internal investigation. But the viral tsunami was too powerful. The video was undeniable. By 3:00 p.m. that day, they issued a formal statement: "Acuity Corp is aware of the disturbing incident involving one of our employees, Robert Peterson. Mr. Peterson's alleged behavior is abhorrent and does not reflect the values of our company. He has been placed on indefinite administrative leave, effective immediately pending a full investigation." For Robert, administrative leave was the first real crack in his fortress. This wasn't just a legal problem anymore. It was an existential threat to the career he had meticulously built over 3 decades. Meanwhile, in a small office in downtown Seattle, a young but sharp lawyer named Jessica Alvarez was having coffee with a shaken but determined Sarah Jenkins. A women's advocacy group, having seen the story online, had reached out to Sarah and offered pro bono legal representation. Jessica was listening intently, her pen flying across her legal pad. "They're going to try to paint you as a negligent mother." Jessica said, her tone direct but empathetic. "They'll say Leo was out of control, that you were inattentive, that Peterson was provoked. We need to be prepared for that." "He was just being a kid," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "He dropped a toy." "I know, and we'll prove that," Jessica assured her. "The video is a huge help. And this witness, Dr. Thorne, he's our rock, a credible, unimpeachable medical professional. His testimony will be invaluable. But Peterson has money and power. He'll fight this." As the media storm raged, David Chen sat in his gray cubicle at Acuity Corp, feeling like the walls were closing in. The office was a hive of frantic whispers. Everyone had seen the video. They had seen the news reports naming his boss. David felt sick. His lie to the police felt like a stone in his gut. He had seen everything clearly. He had seen Robert's escalating irrational anger. He had seen the slap. His silence was a betrayal of a child and his mother, and a betrayal of his own conscience. His fear of Robert Peterson was immense. The man was a notorious bully in the office, known for destroying the careers of those who crossed him. But the image of Leo's tear-streaked face was burned into his memory. That evening, David went home to his small apartment and rewatched the news. A segment came on featuring a short interview with a child psychologist. When an authority figure, a strange adult, commits an act of violence against a child, especially with racial overtones, it's not just a physical blow, the psychologist explained. It's a blow to their sense of safety in the world. It tells them that the world is a hostile place where they can be hurt for no reason. The long-term effects can be devastating. Something inside David snapped. His complicity felt unbearable. His career wasn't worth this. With trembling hands, he looked up the contact information for Sarah's lawyer, Jessica Alvarez, which a news article had mentioned. He stared at the number for a long time. Making this call would mean detonating his career, inviting the full wrath of Robert Peterson and his legal team. But staying silent felt like a kind of spiritual death. He took a deep breath and dialed the number. Jessica Alvarez's office, a receptionist answered. Hello, David said, his voice barely a whisper. My name is David Chen. I was on Flight 421. I worked with Robert Peterson. I was sitting next to him. I lied to the police. I saw everything. And there's more. There's so much more than what happened on that plane. On the other end of the line, Jessica Alvarez sat up straight, a surge of adrenaline coursing through her. This was it. This was the key. This was the call that would change everything. Jessica Alvarez met David Chen the next day at a discreet coffee shop far from both their offices. David was visibly nervous, constantly glancing over his shoulder. He clutched a briefcase to his chest like a shield. Thank you for calling me, David. Jessica, began, her voice calm and reassuring. I know this must be difficult. Difficult doesn't even begin to cover it, he said, his voice shaky. You have to understand what Robert is like. He's not just a jerk. He's vindictive. He keeps records. He ruins people. Tell me what you meant when you said there was so much more, Jessica prompted gently. David took a deep breath and opened his briefcase. He pulled out a slim laptop. Robert's racism, the thing on the plane, that wasn't a one-off bad day. That's who he is. He's a VP of acquisitions. He has huge influence over hiring, firing, and development contracts for our firm. He turned the laptop around. For the last year, I've been his junior analyst. I manage his schedules, his expenses, his files. He's not careful with his digital footprint. He thinks he's untouchable. David opened a password-protected folder. It was filled with files, saved email threads, audio recordings from his phone, and spreadsheets. It was a meticulously kept archive of corporate malfeasance. Look at this, he said, clicking on an email chain. The subject was Candidate Review, Westfield Project. In it, Robert gave a scathing and dismissive review of a highly qualified black candidate for a project manager position, using coded language like not a good cultural fit and lacks the right kind of polish. He then championed a far less experienced white candidate who happened to be the son of a friend. He played a short audio file. It was a recording of a meeting with Robert's voice clearly audible. I don't care what their resume says, Robert's voice sneered. I'm not putting a guy named Jamal in front of the city council. Find me a Mark or a Scott. There was more. A spreadsheet David had created, cross-referencing company data, showed a clear pattern. In the departments Robert oversaw, minority employees were hired at a 40% lower rate than the company average, and their promotion track was on average 3 years longer. He had systematically blocked contracts from being awarded to minority-owned construction firms, often overriding the recommendations of his own team. Jessica stared at the screen, her mind racing. This was a corporate H-bomb. The incident on the plane was the public face of a deep systemic rot. Robert Peterson wasn't just an angry man who slapped a child. He was a gatekeeper who used his power to enforce his bigoted worldview, impacting countless lives and careers. Why did you save all this? Jessica asked, her voice awed. At first it was just self-preservation, David admitted, shamefaced. I thought if he ever tried to fire me or make me a scapegoat, I'd have leverage. But after I saw what he did to that little boy, I couldn't just use it to save my own skin. This is bigger than me. "David, you are incredibly brave," Jessica said, and she meant it. "This evidence changes the entire scope of the case. This is no longer just a civil suit for assault and battery against Robert Peterson. This is potentially a massive class action lawsuit against Acuity Corp for discriminatory practices." The legal strategy shifted instantly. Jessica filed a notice of intent to sue not only Robert Peterson for the harm caused to Sarah and Leo, but also Acuity Corp. The lawsuit alleged that the company had fostered a toxic environment, negligently supervised a known bigot in a position of power, and engaged in a pattern of racial discrimination, with the assault on Leo Jenkins being the most egregious and public manifestation of that corporate culture. The evidence David Chen provided was the linchpin. They had emails, they had audio, they had statistical proof. When Acuity Corp's legal team received the notice and a sample of the evidence Jessica's office provided, panic turned into sheer terror. Their initial strategy of isolating and firing Robert Peterson was no longer viable. They were now directly implicated. The potential liability was catastrophic, not just financially, but to their brand and their ability to do business. A public discovery process would unearth all the skeletons David Chen had so carefully collected. Their CEO, Mark Fallon, saw the writing on the wall. A protracted legal battle would be a slow public execution of their company's reputation. He moved decisively. First, Robert Peterson was summarily fired for cause his severance package and stock options voided. The company publicly stated that their internal investigation had revealed a pattern of behavior completely incompatible with the values and legal obligations of Acuity Corp. Second, their lawyers contacted Jessica Alvarez. They didn't want to fight. They wanted to settle. For Robert Peterson, this was the ultimate betrayal. The company he had dedicated his life to, the one he had made millions for, had cut him loose and thrown him to the wolves. His own legal team warned him that with the evidence David Chen had provided, any defense was futile. The company would likely testify against him to save itself. His professional life was over. His name was toxic. The business journals that once celebrated him were now writing lengthy exposés on his downfall. Colleagues who once clapped him on the back now crossed the street to avoid him. The karma, however, was just getting started. The news of the impending lawsuit against Acuity Corp, spearheaded by the evidence from the whistleblower on Flight 421, became a national story. Lawyers began hearing from other former Acuity employees, people who had been mysteriously laid off, passed over for promotions, or had their ideas shot down by Robert Peterson. A class action suit began to form, representing dozens of individuals whose careers had been stymied by his bigotry. The dominoes were falling, and they were falling hard, all because one man's private prejudice had exploded into a public act of violence, and another man's quiet conscience had refused to let it stand. The intricate architecture of Robert Peterson's life, built on foundations of intimidation and privilege, did not merely crack, it imploded. The fallout was a relentless, multifaceted storm of karma, each thunderclap a direct consequence of the ugly storm he had unleashed at 35,000 feet. The legal proceedings were the first wave. The negotiations between Jessica Alvarez and Acuity Corp were less a battle of wits and more a controlled demolition. Robert was forced to sit in a sterile conference room flanked by company lawyers whose job was no longer to protect him, but to surgically sever him from the corporate body to save the whole. He listened in impotent rage as they conceded point after point to Jessica, whose calm demeanor only sharpened the sting of her victory. The settlement offered to Sarah and Leo Jenkins was staggering. It wasn't just a sum, it was a statement, a corporate apology written in zeros. It guaranteed Leo's education through any university he chose, funded a trust for his long-term therapeutic needs, and provided Sarah with a level of financial security that would allow her to dedicate her life to her son's healing and her own newfound purpose. Robert's signature on the documents felt like signing his own obituary. His criminal case offered no such clean transaction. Standing before the judge, the courtroom packed with journalists, his expensive suit seemed to hang off him, a hollow costume of a man he no longer was. He pleaded guilty as advised, hoping for mercy. But the judge, a woman known for her sharp intellect and low tolerance for bullies, had read every line of the case file. "Mr. Peterson," she began, her voice cutting through the silent courtroom, "you speak in your plea of a momentary lapse in judgment. But the evidence suggests something far more insidious. It suggests a worldview where you believe your comfort is paramount and that a child, particularly a black child, is not a person deserving of basic respect, but an obstacle to be disciplined at your whim. You did not just strike a child, sir. You attacked his sense of safety in the world. She looked at Sarah, who sat in the front row, holding Leo's small hand. Then her gaze returned to Robert, hard as flint. The community will not tolerate this. I sentence you to 30 days in the King County Jail, to be followed by 2 years of supervised probation. You will complete an intensive anger management program and a course on racial bias and cultural sensitivity. Furthermore, you will perform 200 hours of community service working with at-risk youth. Perhaps there you will finally learn what it means to build someone up instead of tearing them down. The sharp crack of the gavel was the final nail in the coffin of his public life. The photos that circulated the next day, Robert Peterson, the titan of real estate trading his silk tie for a baggy orange jumpsuit, became the defining image of his fall. Yet the most devastating karma was not delivered by a judge, but in the quiet of his own home. His wife, Catherine, had watched the news reports with a growing sense of sickness. The evidence David Chen had unearthed, the sneering audio clips, the casually cruel emails revealed a stranger living in her husband's skin. The casual bigotry she had once dismissed as old-fashioned or stress-talking was in fact the core of his operational philosophy. One evening, as he sat nursing a scotch amidst the wreckage of his reputation, she confronted him. "I defended you, Robert," she said, her voice devoid of its usual warmth. "I told our friends it was a misunderstanding. I believed you." "It was a bad day, Kathy," he mumbled, unable to meet her eyes. "No," she said, her voice firm. "A bad day is when the stock market dips. A bad day is not revealing yourself to be a cruel, hateful man who would strike a child. I read the depositions. I heard the recordings. The man on that plane, that is who you are. And I cannot and will not live with that man." Her departure was swift and absolute. The divorce proceedings were a final humiliation, dissecting their shared life and assets. The sprawling Bellevue mansion, once a symbol of his power, became an anchor of debt. It was sold at a loss. Their friends, the couples they entertained, the social network built on the currency of status, vanished like morning mist. Robert Peterson found himself adrift in his mid-60s. He moved into a sterile 2-bedroom rental condo overlooking a parking lot. The silence was the loudest thing in the room. There were no deals to close, no subordinates to intimidate, no galas to attend. There was only the endless echo of his own failure, a self-inflicted exile, where he was forced to confront the hollow man he had become. In stark contrast, Sarah Jenkins's world began to bloom. The settlement was a tool, not a solution. She used it to build a new foundation. The first step was buying a modest but charming house in Seattle's Ravenna neighborhood, with a big backyard and a sturdy oak tree. One of the first things she and Leo did was plant a small Japanese maple next to it, a symbol of their new roots. Leo's therapy was a slow, delicate process. He worked with a kind, patient child psychologist who helped him build a new narrative for what happened, one where he was not a victim, but a survivor, and where his mother and the kind strangers on the plane were heroes. As Leo healed, Sarah found her calling. Messages poured in from people who had seen her story. Other parents who had faced similar ugly encounters in park stores and schools. She realized her ordeal was not unique. It was just the one that had been caught on camera. With a portion of the settlement and the guidance of Jessica Alvarez, she established the Leo Project. It was a nonprofit dedicated to connecting families with free legal resources, trauma counseling, and advocacy training. Sarah, once a quiet nurse, became a powerful voice, speaking at community meetings and on news programs, not with anger, but with the unshakable authority of lived experience. Marcus Thorne remained a steady, quiet presence in their new life. He politely but firmly rejected all media requests, once telling a persistent reporter, "The story isn't about me, it's about doing the right thing when you're in a position to do so. That shouldn't be exceptional." He returned to the organized chaos of the Harborview ER, but he would meet Sarah for coffee once a month, serving as an unofficial medical advisor for her project, a quiet friend who had been there at the very beginning. And David Chen, the man whose conscience had turned the tide, walked a path of redemption. Acuity Corp, desperate to signal a new era, offered him a promotion to a management position in their ethics and compliance division. He accepted not out of ambition, but out of a sense of duty. He became an internal force for change, dismantling the old boys club systems Robert had perfected. He championed blind resume reviews, implemented robust anti-discrimination training, and created a secure, anonymous channel for employees to report misconduct without fear of reprisal. He had risked his career to expose a rotten system, and in doing so had been given the power to help rebuild it. The story of Flight 421 thus closed not with a single act of vengeance, but with a rebalancing of scales. It became a testament to the fact that while one person's hate can cause immense harm, the collective courage of others, a doctor, a mother, a guilt-ridden colleague, can create a current of justice so powerful, it can reshape lives, reform institutions, and turn a story of trauma into a legacy of hope. What began as a journey of hope for a mother and son turned into a crucible of hate, courage, and ultimately profound justice. The story of Flight 421 is a stark reminder that the worst moments can bring out the best in people. It wasn't a superhero who changed everything. It was an ER doctor who saw a wrong and chose to speak. It was a junior employee who risked his career for what was right. And it was a mother whose love for her child became a catalyst for change that would help countless others. Their collective courage created a tidal wave of consequences that washed away a man's empire of hate and replaced it with a legacy of hope. If this story moved you, please consider hitting that like button and sharing it with others. These are the stories that need to be told. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more real-life dramas where everyday people make an extraordinary difference. Thank you for listening.